Hi everyone and welcome to this talk. I am Ali Darvishi, a PhD student in Learning Analytics at the University of Queensland. Peer review has been recognized as an effective method for promoting higher order thinking while providing students with timely feedback. Yet, some concerns about the quality limit its adoption. In the regular peer review system, students first assess the correctness of content and then fill out a rubric and justify their decision with comments. The main points of concern are that students' evaluations are diverse and their feedback may be ineffective and of low quality. Previous research suggests three explanations for why a student may fail to offer effective feedback. First, they are not equipped with the required skill set to provide high quality feedback. The second explanation is that a student may be aware of best practices for writing effective feedback, but they may not have the agency to monitor their work following the best practices. And third, they may lack the required incentive to invest the time and efforts as they think quality of their contributions is not reviewed. This paper presents a complementary peer review approach to help mitigate these shortcomings and improve peer feedback. For the required skill set, tips and training materials with examples are provided on how to deliver effective feedback. For the lack of agency to monitor their work, a self-monitoring checklist is incorporated to help students track if their provided comments follows the best practices for writing effective feedback. And finally, for the lack of the required incentive, quality control functions are developed that automatically assess the quality of the submitted feedback and ask students to improve if necessary. First, informed by higher education research on feedback quality, a set of training materials is considered that may help a student provide effective feedback. Students are guided to consider 4 criteria: be aligned with rubrics, be detailed and specific, suggest improvements, and use constructive language. Explicit positive and negative examples of how the recommendations might be used in practice are included in the training. Then, informed by higher education research on self-regulated strategies, a self-monitoring checklist is provided to reinforce the use of the guidelines provided by the training materials and help a student track whether they have used the recommended tips in their feedback. Finally, using recent advances in natural language processing, a set of quality control functions evaluates the submitted text and prompts the student to improve if necessary. In this study, a between subject experiment is conducted to answer the following research questions. Research question 1. To what extent do students engage with the complementary approach? Research question 2. What is the impact of the complementary approach on peer feedback quality? And research question 3. What is the impact of the complementary approach on a student judgment? For this study, data was collected from two offerings, semester 1 and semester 2, of two undergraduate courses in 2021, Introduction to Information Systems, or INFS, and the Brain and Behavioral Sciences, or NEOR. A student in semester 1 that used the non-complemented peer review interface were considered the control group, and the student enrolled in semester 2 that used the complemented peer review interface were considered the experiment group. Also, we apply propensity score matching to match each student in the experiment group with a student from the control group so that the two students are similar on the set of their characteristics, including their knowledge state, the number of resources that they attempted, and the number of resources that they created. Distributions of the selected characteristics represent the achievement of PSM in reducing the inequalities between the experiment and control groups. Our first hypothesis was that the majority of students would engage with the complementary approach. However, the finding did not support this hypothesis, and roughly half of the students engaged with the interventions explicitly. Also, the data show that the system flagged less than 20% of comments. This result is promising as it suggests that we expected around 80% of the reviews to contain some suggestion or a specific detail related to the resource under review. However, when a comment was flagged, the majority of students opt to submit it without a revision. Our second hypothesis was that the complementary approach enables a student to provide higher quality feedback. Collected data validated this hypothesis and show that students in the experiment group provided significantly longer comments and received more likes. Also, the improvements in the various qualitative features suggest that the complementary approach successfully assisted the students, particularly in providing constructive and more specific feedback. Our third hypothesis was that if a student were more engaged with the feedback, they would be less lenient and more confident in their reviews. Part of our assumption was that more detailed comments might make a student more critical, resulting in a drop in their decision ratings, and similarly, it would increase a student's trust in their judgment, resulting in higher confidence rating. Our research, on the other hand, contradicts this hypothesis. These results supported the commonly reported issue of the leniency bias, the tendency to offer mostly positive ratings in self and peer assessment. In summary, we first integrated multiple approaches to address various causes for a student's inability to offer effective feedback, including lack of a skill, agency, or incentive. Second, we utilized cutting-edge AI assistants to automatically analyze the quality of submitted feedback and notify students of areas where there is a room for improvement. And finally, we conducted an in-field between subject study on the impact of interventions on feedback quality, which has implications for the adoption and implementation of feedback tools. We acknowledge three main limitations to the current study. One, the study explored the impact of training, self-monitoring, and quality control functions together as a unified model, which makes it hard to verify the impact of each intervention. Accordingly, a future direction could be to expand the control study to 5 experimental conditions: rubric only, training, self-monitoring, oversight, and the combined model. Second, other than relatedness and explicit suggestions, the quality control functions do not consider other aspects of quality feedback. So future research could address this limitation by fine-tuning NLP models to measure additional features such as alignment and constructive language. Third, the conducted study did not consider a student's demographic and personal information. However, differences in a student's characteristics such as their language proficiencies, native vs non-native speaker, could impact how a student interpret and apply the provided feedback. Therefore, an interesting future direction would be to conduct control experiments that take demographic and personal information of a student into account when interpreting the results. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, it's time for questions. Both Ali and Hassan are online to answering your questions. Let's them on the screen.
I love this line of work and improving providing feedback is, seems like it's not only useful for aiding others learning, but something you want to do well in all kinds of future jobs. But I wonder, is learning to give better feedback maybe something that a performance aid isn't quite enough for, because it's a skill that requires some deliberate practice, some repetition with feedback? If so, maybe they're a little bit more upfront. Training with practice might enhance the impact. What do you think?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, yes, the practice is the key to improving most of the learning aspect, and especially in providing feedback. What we consider here is we try to address different reasons as to why a student in this particular online platform provide usually short feedback or non-effective comments on their on this platform. So one of the reasons we consider was they might know how to provide the effective feedback, but they don't have for example, the incentive. They think it just need to pass this assignment if it's part of their assignment to provide the feedback, and they just provide a very short answer to that. So this kind of quality control functions helps to mitigate this shortcoming. So yeah.
I might add to that. Thank you for the question. And maybe one interesting addition to look at would be to look at the quality over time that we haven't looked at in this study. But perhaps to look at over the period of 13 weeks of the semester, as students get more practice in providing feedback and the training we give them, is there actually a trend up? Unfortunately, there's so many other factors in a semester that would also impact, usually by the end of the semester, students don't necessarily have as much incentive or engagement with the course. So other aspects may also contribute to that difference, but it's a really interesting question to see if it's something that gets better over time.
I'm going to also just recommend if you have a question, maybe it would be nice to know who's asking the question. So maybe just say your name and your affiliation before you ask your question.
Thank you. So my name's Nicola Wilkin. I'm based at the University of Birmingham, UK. And I'm responsible for a large number of postgraduate markers. And I wondered if you had used this system in any way to help them learn what would look like good feedback, because they've just changed from students. And if they haven't been through a program like this, they don't necessarily know what good feedback would look like, particularly for a weaker student, because that's not typically been them.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Not specifically, but it's a great idea to do that. So this is what we're presenting based on is a learner sourcing system where everyone in the class essentially becomes a marker and a reviewer. And yeah, I think earlier versions of the platform that we're using, we were just taking it for granted that, you know, students can provide feedback and everybody was a marker essentially without the training or sort of the monitoring or the AI additions to help them with that. And essentially, as you're saying, we're finding that the training and also the oversight is critical, especially for non-experts, as students, experts in training will take on marking of their peers.
Questions? I have one question, Hassan, only. Yep. How, given your results, given your findings, what do you think will be the next step to trying to go, not just providing this AI help, but how you provide these, let's say, how you make them be very honest with their feedback, they actually criticizing or giving constructive feedback to the student? What other alternatives to just helping evaluate the quality of the feedback could be there?
Yeah, great question. I can have a first step, and Ali, if you had anything, please by all means add to it. So one of the main things that we've been trying to do within the system is, you know, from a game theory design mechanism, how do you incentivize honesty so that everybody is honest about the sort of feedback and mark they're providing. And at least our work and others have shown that peer reviewers are generally more lenient in marking compared to experts. So that has been part of our struggle, that we find that when we ask students to review, they're generally more lenient than instructors. And a lot of the feedback that we've tried to give them was our way of trying to also make their judgment more accurate. But as RQ3 showed, as Ali was talking to it, that while we've seen some improvements to the quality of the feedback that they provide, there's actually hasn't been a shift in their judgment. So there might be other aspects that need to be considered to see if we can also make students, and maybe that might be sort of a knowledge related aspect, that they might not necessarily have the right knowledge, and giving them more feedback literacy is not going to help with that. So there might be another intervention required to make sure that they're more honest or more accurate in terms of how they're marking. I don't know if I got your question right, or if that was the right.
No, yeah, that was my question. Thank you, Hassan.
We got some we got some questions on Zoom as well. So let me just read them all, and then I'll let you answer them in whatever order you like. The first one is from Reza. Actually, Reza, you're right there. But why don't you ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. I have actually a tiny suggestion and one question. Some scholars like Gary King do not recommend using propensity score for matching, and instead they suggest maybe more recent methods like quotient exact matching. So I have two questions. What covariates do you use for your matching? Because we know that PSM is a little bit limited. And how do you calculate the propensity score matching for your work?
Ali, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. For the covariates, we use their knowledge state and the number of item they have answered on the platform and the number of resources that they have created. So there are lots of other covariates that you can include in this type of matching, but we just limited to what we had on the platform. So we don't search other type of, like one of the limitation of our work was that we don't consider those demographic or other information for matching. So that's for that. And for the your comments, I think I've seen that paper actually, and well, we have actually mentioned this in the paper that usually in this kind of a study, using the random trial is a gold standard, but sometimes it's not possible to do that randomized control experiment. So we use this propensity score matching to have at least much more fair comparison between these two groups. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much for your great talk.
Great question, Reza. Mike or Aaron, is there another question?
Okay, so I just was quickly going to ask about, like, if you found any confounding factors in the between subjects design, and then if the order of the intervention played a role in terms of like your results, like the record. And if you would like to design the study differently, what would you do?
Yeah, Ali had it as one of our sort of limitations at the end, that essentially the intervention had 3 different parts to it, that we cannot necessarily know which one of the 3 was most helpful in terms of helping students improve their writing. And the future work is to run it based on 5 decisions, so a 5-way controlled experiment where we look at each of the decisions separately and then all of them together. In a different study that we had done, actually, we found that having all 3, so we had 3 separate interventions that each worked well, but then the 3 together was not as effective, mostly because it was just cognitive overload by that time for the students. So it would actually be interesting to see if any other combination rather than the 3, 1, 2, or a combination of those might actually work better than having all 3 together.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, this is Ken Kadinger again. Asked the first question. Just as a follow-up, that the thing you raised about, could be that it's not a knowledge gap, that it's a motivation gap, right? They don't want to give feedback. That seems like that's a super research question, and it makes me wonder, like, could you do some upfront assessment of their ability to provide peer feedback, right? Like where you give them a scenario where they're supposed to give feedback, and you know what good feedback should be to that scenario. Can they recognize and distinguish not good feedback from good feedback? I bet if you did that in a class where they got credit for it, you could solve the motivation problem right on a short assessment, and then you could tell whether.
Absolutely.
I think that'd be a super cool thing to do.
Thanks for the follow-up question, Ken. So I think absolutely having a pre and post, or having an actual question that they need to pass before we allow them to do peer feedback is a great idea. And I know some other systems do use that when they're using peer learning, that you need to pass a bar before you're kind of allowed to do the peer assessment or provide peer feedback. Our way of kind of determining that was sort of the NLP functions that was identifying when they had their initial response was not of a high quality. And in 40% of the time, we just needed to tell them that we don't think this is good enough. And then they change it to something that at least the system thought it was good enough. So I think for a large portion of the class, it was the case that they might have not had the incentive. And once they knew someone's looking over their shoulder, they actually went back and changed it. it was quite hard to determine how it's designed in different courses and to what extent it would be looked at carefully before it's marked, whether they pass it for a mark or not. But absolutely, I think it's an interesting follow-up to look at whether it's incentive or whether it's actually that they need the training.
Okay. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, Ali. We move to our next speaker.
Thanks everyone for the great questions and your feedback.